Welcome to the YouTube channel for the HR M&A Roundtable. I'm Dr. Clint Kendrick, chair of the HR M&A Roundtable and author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. The HR M&A Roundtable is a forum for practitioners teaching practitioners how people, leadership, and culture drive M&A deal value. We provide a variety of opportunities for HR M&A practitioners to connect with one another, including an annual conference, webinars, a Women in HR M&A mastermind group, and of course, roundtables. I started the HR M&A Roundtable because peer learning is an invaluable resource, especially if you're new to the HR M&A space. As an experienced practitioner and HR M&A leader at a Fortune 500 company, I continue to rely on the Roundtable to stay up to date with the latest trends and thinking in HR M&A. You can learn more about the HR M&A Roundtable by visiting www.mandaroundtable.com, where you can find information on our organization and the many resources we provide for HR M&A practitioners. While you're there, sign up for our mailing list so you can stay informed about our upcoming events.
Right now.
All right. Thanks so much, Clint. It's great to be talking to this group again. We spoke at the September event, and obviously there's a lot that's happened since then. And one of the things that has happened since then is deal volume has picked back up. So I think a lot of people that and we even had a session on this, that what is going to happen to people that kind of dedicated their career or a substantial amount of their professional time into M&A. Well, things are heating up from everything we're hearing and working on. There's a lot of deals that either are in the early stages of execution, or certainly a lot of deals that are being contemplated. This session is a little bit different from previous sessions we've done in the sense that it's a little bit more inwardly focused. You know, there's an aspect of HR integration that we find, even in all our experience, gets overlooked all too often. And that is the decisions that HR needs to make for itself, the roles that HR needs to play, and how HR in general shows up in a deal. So that's really what we want to cover here. Clint, if you can just click through the next probably 2 slides. What we are going to focus on is a little bit about HR org structure, how that changes during the course of the deal, and how different deal types impact how HR org structure changes or does not change. We're going to talk a fair bit about role modeling, all the different things that HR needs to do that may or may not tie to the specific role that you have in the deal. And then we are going to talk a little bit about more of the personal journey. How do you manage your own energy capacity and really even wellness through some of these transactions that can be very demanding of all of those factors. As I mentioned, we're not going to cover, this is not to say that these topics on the right-hand side are not important. They're absolutely critical. But all of the things that HR does to add value to a deal, harmonizing compensation, benefits, talent, HR systems, and so on, that's really not the focus of our session today. It's really more, again, HR structure, role modeling, and personal journeys. Let's go to the next slide. So when we talk in particular about HR roles and organization structure, one of the biggest factors that determines that the decision is the relative size of deal. So when you have smaller tuck-in deals, really the acquirer is calling the shots. That's not to say that they're not exceptions of, you know, big company acquiring small company, and the small company's CHRO becomes the CHRO. It does happen, but it's rare. Most of the cases, what happens is CHRO from big company or the acquirer, the smaller company's HR leader. Again, you know, small and big are relative terms for certain acquisitions. The small company might be $500 million in revenue with 1,000 employees. For some others, you could be talking about acquiring a dental practice with 20 employees, right? There's a massive spectrum of size and deal type and so on. But if we were to generalize, there's a couple of scenarios that tend to play out. Is in tuck-in deals, synergy is not a huge consideration. It is a consideration, but not as big as merger of equals type of deal. So the HR leader may become leader of the standalone business unit. We find, in particular, if the entire top leadership team goes, usually they move en masse to start a new company, then the HR leader may leave with them. HR business partners, the acquirers' business partners will add to their job scope, and if the acquisition stays intact, then this may even be the CHRO of the acquired company. They become either the lead HR business partner, or if it's broken into functions, then the roles may be reassigned. The COEs on the acquisition side, they may not have as many. Again, by definition, the acquisition, this is a tuck-in deal we're talking about, they may not have the full comport of specialists on exec comp and health and welfare benefits and so on and so forth. So that's another situation where there's not a huge amount of change. But there are cases where now that you were, let's say, a 500 million company acquiring a 100 million company at about 600, 700 million mark, going on to $1 billion, this acquisition may give you a slightly larger scale. So the COEs may become a little bit more specialized. So an example might be that you can afford with this new acquisition, or certainly if you had 2 or 3 of these acquisitions, you can afford to have a health and welfare specialist or 2 of them, and so on and so forth. So you may get more specialized as you do more acquisitions. And then finally, with shared services, again, in a smaller deal, it is less likely that you will have a full, HR shared services model. So it's the existing acquirers shared services center that will take on this newer employee population. So it's fairly standard. We can move to the next slide. Yeah. So it's the larger deals, and larger does not always mean larger in size, but by larger, it's typically the deals that are more equivalent size companies, right? That's where you have many more decision points. In general, and there are more exceptions on this than certainly in the previous one, the acquirer CHRO will remain in position. The exception are, and we just worked through a deal about 2 years ago where the acquired company was about 1/3 the size. So it's still a big difference, 1/3 the size, but the acquired company CEO became CEO of the combination. And as a result, almost the entire HR leadership team got wiped out. CHRO went, head of total rewards went, the head of all business partners went, and it was completely new management in HR. That was certainly the exception, though. And again, if you have true merger of equals where companies are within 10, 20, 30% of each other, then there is and certainly should be a proper selection process on who's the better fit for the combined company, given not the place where we've been, but the place where we want to go. So a true selection process based on the competencies that you value in the future. And again, I won't dwell too much on each of these rows. HR business partners, again, significant change if you have a true merger of equals or even larger companies merging. You'll have multiple layers of business partners, lead HR business partners that might have all of enterprise products, and then you'll have within that divisions, geographic or otherwise. So you will get many more layers in these larger deals than you had previously. COEs, again, these are deals, larger deals will have a more material synergy component. So it's not that you're going to retain both heads of exec comp or both heads of any HR function, both heads of benefits, both heads of payroll. Somebody's got to go because synergy requirements are real in these kinds of deals. So there's that balance versus some kind of unique expertise that is possessed on both sides. So there's much more of a balancing act. And then shared services by definition are going to be merged. The exception we find, again, with the mega deals, that if there's one of the acquisitions has a service center, let's say an offshore service center or an outsourced service center that the acquiree did not have, then they will want to retain that to maximize their coverage. And this is another one where now with even bigger scale, you will look at your delivery model in a comprehensive way down the road. Let's go to the next slide. This slide is really talking about the journey. It picks up on the larger deals. So the key point here is that the complexity in larger deals, the complexity of merging HR in larger deals is pretty significant. And you really don't want to get to final stage. There's usually a lot of pressure and discussion and debate about who we want to be in the future. The point of this slide is you have to approach it in stages. And what we found is kind of this somewhat simplified but easy to understand 3-stage model that really helps. In the first few weeks, let's just call it 0 to 90 days, all you want to accomplish, again, we're talking about larger deals, we're not talking about small tuck-ins here, staple together the 2 HR organizations, get the reporting structure together, get people on a common cadence, get them focused on the integration aspects. Going forward is when you have, let's say 3 months out or so, is when you can have full integration, the new coverage models come into play, you have more time to discover the unique requirements of different populations and so on. You might have sort of the early stages of system integration, process integration in the 3, 4, 5 month time frame. And that's when you can have full integration or true integration of the organizations. Moving to a truly new operating model. So let's say you had a 5 billion company merging with a 3 billion company. Now you're $8 billion. You have, let's say, from 10% of non-North America employees, you went to 30% non-North America employees. That asks for a totally different HR operating model. Those kinds of decisions will be driven by this acquisition, but really will be taken much further out when you can talk about reshaping your COEs, you can talk about wider coverage model, the classic ratio that gets pulled out with HR. Well, did you have 1:60 kind of HR to FTE ratio? Well, now in a bigger scale, maybe you go to 1:100, maybe you were go to 1:150 and so on and so forth. Those kinds of more deeper changes in coverage, operating models, and so on will be much further out. And we're just saying it's 180 days, let's say 6 months out from day of close. And next slide. So I'll hand it over to Craig, and he'll talk about how one of these super large deals unfolded.
Great, and I'll go through this, but what I'd like to also do, kind of at the end, and even if you want to submit questions through chat, through the chat feature, we'll address those, as we get to the end of this, because again, this is where I think it, maybe starts to get a little more interactive. But I did want to share the experience of being on point for the Dell EMC integration. So the role I specifically played, I was 2 in a box with my EMC counterpart, on point for leading all the org, talent, change, culture, and all of that. But also, we were actually HR for the integration. So the integration teams, setting the expectations. So if you think of that almost as its own business, we were basically the HR leaders for that as well. And honestly, a lot of the experiences I'm kind of reflecting on here are in that capacity. And again, it's also looking at our own function. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about really applies to any function, but usually we skip over it for ourselves because we think as HR practitioners, oh, we get all this stuff. This is what we do. Let's just go talk about what we do for everyone else. And I've got lots of stories that I think prove that's not necessarily the case. So again, just the overall situation. Again, this is a large merger of equals. And the numbers you see on the right-hand side looks like a significant difference in size, from Dell to EMC. But even on the EMC side, there were actually a lot of other employees through their portfolio of companies like VMware. So, and again, just based on market cap, revenues, profitability, it was a merger of equals. Again, even, without the disparity in the number of employees. So some of the things, clearly the need for high volume of mission critical decisions and really fast. It's, if you look at HR more than any other function, a lot of the deliverables and decisions that need to be made are far sooner than any other function. So again, while some of the other functions may have the opportunity to stew a little bit around in dysfunction before they get their legs under them, in HR, we really don't have that luxury. And one of the things compounding this is the HR and the broader org structure is going to be defined long after all of these decisions need to be made. So, the trick is, how do you make all of those decisions absent a structure that is built to make decisions? Human nature creates its own challenges. And again, I will challenge anyone who thinks that as HR practitioners, we are above this, but you get the fear and anxiety. Avneet had mentioned, in a merger of equals, inevitably there's big synergy challenges. And the first thing everyone is thinking about is, geez, am I going to have a role when this thing is all over? So again, I think that's one of those to the point of put your own oxygen mask on first. I think we need to make eye contact and deal with that before we start dealing with that for the broader organization. There's also, even once you get past the fear and anxiety, even for people who aren't worried about, losing their job as a part of all of this, there's a level of defensiveness and pride of authorship. And I would argue it's more prevalent in the HR COEs than anywhere. And I know I grew up in one. But in terms of my stuff is better, I'm sure we're just going to adopt all the stuff that I've done over the last few years. And we're going to scrap all that, crappy stuff that the other side has been, stewing around on all these years. And both sides are saying that, by the way. So again, that's another one of those that you look at it and say, it's one of the things that makes a lot of great HR practitioners. They're great at what they do. But when you start then saying, now we're at a point where we're going to have to choose between this or that or doing something different, now all of a sudden you see a bit of human nature creep out that you didn't even necessarily know was there. So again, I think this is one that it's very easy to look over this from an HR standpoint. And David, that's a great question. We'll address that one kind of at the end of this, because I think that's a really good question. But the question here is, how do you deliver to this high bar, all these decisions, quick period of time with an undefined structure and with teams and all of us at our peak anxiety? So again, this is, if you think of the stages that Avneet had laid out, I think the most pronounced here is really, to that 90-day post-close. So it starts before close and then goes to 90-day post, because I'd argue that's where the anxiety and a lot of the uncertainty is at its greatest. Some of it starts to settle after that. But, some of the things that, again, reflecting back on it, some of the things that seem to work pretty well, or, gosh, wish we would have done more of this. And again, you'll see I've broken it into structure, staffing, and process, and then also behaviors. So on the structure, staffing, and process, because again, part of it is you have to design a little bit reflecting this piece of human nature. If we throw everybody into a pit and say, you need to come out with decisions made on all of these things, and oh, by the way, each of you have a deep pride of authorship, so I just want you to emerge on the other end magically having agreed and aligned on everything. That is not going to happen. It just, and again, looking at some of the most talented people I've ever worked with in my entire career, that is unreasonable to ask them to do that. Again, in this short period of time. Having a project structure, so you say, listen, we're not going to create a project team that presupposes an end state org structure. We're going to build this based on deliverables. So these work streams are not boxes in a future org chart. They are deliverables that need to be met. And again, the critical, and this is one of the things I think worked really well, people will say, oh, this is bureaucratic and it slows things down, but having 2 in a box for every single stream is critical. Could you get to faster decisions with only 1? Yeah, probably. Would they be decisions you'd want to live with? And is that the way you want to manage the change and kind of manage this new organization? Absolutely not. So again, I think that piece is critical. It's not just those boxes, but who you put in those boxes. And again, whether you're someone who's assigning people to boxes or you're one of those folks hoping to get assigned to one of these boxes, the critical piece here is not just selecting people for technical capability, but honestly, at least as important is the intangibles. Is this someone who's empathetic, data-driven, collaborative, and all that? Because I can get someone who's won the Nobel Prize for compensation, but if they aren't those things, I don't want them anywhere near this because, they're going to derail, disrupt, and create all kinds of issues. The well-defined decision-making process and cadence and clear decision rights, because again, I think in reality, in any of the functions, you'll probably get to an aligned recommendation like 70% of the time that says, okay, well, we've looked at what we do, what you do, what the market does. Here's what we recommend. There's going to be 30% of the time where it's just an agree to disagree. And, rather than, having everyone fight to the death on which proposal goes forward, just having to say, listen, we've narrowed it down to these two alternatives. Here's the case for one. Here's the case for the other. How do we address, how are we going to, address the decision-making in that? And again, whether the HR leader has been named, in a lot of cases, they will have been, but even if not, having some kind of a governance structure that really allows you to address that. So on the behavior side, and again, I think this is one, that is critical for anybody who plays any part in the deal, but we should first be the ones to really set the expectations for the enterprise. We're going through the ringer before everyone else is, again, because of just the nature of the decisions that need to be made. So we can clearly set the tone. Everyone else is watching us, and how we do on this is critical. Empathy, and you're going to hear me say this, and then when we get to a case study on smaller examples, empathy is the most critical piece. Because again, if you look at it and say, hey, how would I feel if somebody came in and just did a presentation about how stupid all the stuff I've been designing was for the last 3 years? I'd probably get a little angry. So maybe I'm not going to take that tone. Maybe I need to kind of back off and be a little bit more, even and objective and all of that. The other thing is as the leaders for this, one of the things we did, and honestly, I think it maybe was one of the more critical things, we drove a pretty good degree of accountability for both the behaviors and the deliverables. Probably 80, 90% of the people that we had put in these, to co-lead the streams were doing great. And then there were some that clearly don't work well with others. And you're like, ooh, geez, they've turned into a caged animal somewhere in this process. So we had a pretty good course correct where, again, we were able to get in and say, hey, listen, I'm getting a lot of feedback that you're not really partnering well here. And, I'm not seeing, get this back to data driven and all that and course correcting. And honestly, there were occasions where we actually had to swap people out because they just could not get past that kind of personal feeling that they had towards, ownership for their own things. And again, I think the other thing I would say is the being objective and data-driven with no pride of authorship. That is really difficult. Again, for people who feel like what they've done is, their life's work and it's really critical. But being able to take a step back and say, I need to be objective enough and data-driven that it may actually lead us in a different direction. And I just have to be okay with that. And there were people that came through this that we said, wow, these people are phenomenal. And I can guarantee you, as we were looking in that 90 to 180 and we're starting to put names in boxes, these behaviors on the right ended up being an enormous factor in who ended up getting slotted into those go-forward jobs. Because, what you didn't want to do is say, wow, these people ruffled so many feathers and built so many enemies. It's hard to put them in a position where they're supposed to be leading in this combined organization. So again, it's like that level of collaborative. And, at the other end of this, I think the team was much stronger and the bonds were extremely tight. So let me kind of stop for a second. I'm going to look at the first questions here. So interested in getting perspective on bringing HR at the early stage of due diligence on deal consideration. It's not uncommon for HR to come in after the deal decision is made. Then strategic human capital issues arise in the final stages of the deal. Your perspective. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'll tell you, I think the ones that are going to rise, and the challenge you have is a lot of the deal groups will say, hey, at this point, we're only looking for stuff that's going to swing purchase price by $100 million. We're not looking to nitpick and build integration plans early and all that. But I think at a minimum, as you start looking at executive populations and just big things that could potentially get in the way of the integration, absolutely that needs to be discussed and addressed. And really, you can't start to get at that unless you're involved very, very early on. So talk about governance on the work streams and projects. How do ties get broken? So this is a good one. I'm a very firm believer. In fact, one of the talk that Avneet and I did several months back really addressed a lot of this. that governance and how the work streams feed up into a broader, that ultimately feed up the substreams within HR, like compensation, executive comp, benefits, HR technology, all flows up through HR, but then HR flows up into a broader. So it's HR, and then there's the finance work stream, products, and all that. So having a very well-defined process where things get escalated as needed through that path, and where you're able to manage interdependencies, that puts an enormous pressure on the people who are managing that engine to have each of the groups escalating, hey, what are the critical dependencies I have on other streams, and how do we work those? Because again, it's, a lot of times these turn into a divide and conquer, and then you don't like the way it snaps back together. That infrastructure and how the M&A integration team is run across all functions is absolutely critical. And a lot of people don't like them because, it puts infrastructure on that they don't appreciate, and everyone complains about the templates and all of that. But if you kind of take a breath and ignore the fact that you have to fill out way more templates than you would like, there's a reason behind it. And again, that's what drives that connectivity and keeps the thing from breaking apart. So how are companies evaluating the human capital that are in the existing roles today, and how do they pick and choose who stays and who goes in a clear, concise, repeatable process? It's interesting. I think this is clearly one of those things you see more in the larger deals. I think you do see more formal evaluation. Now, that said, I would argue most of my experiences is this doesn't get as much focus as it deserves. So one of the things that we've done, again, in this deal and in other deals I've worked, is having a pretty formal process where we're looking, at least down through the first few layers of management, to where we had a pretty deep inspection process to make sure we were balanced in terms of who was coming from each company, what does our gender representation look like, what does our ethnicity representation look like, and at a minimum, it should not get worse, but we should be looking at this as an opportunity to step forward in all of those areas. But again, that requires a more formal process that, I think, HR plays a good role in influencing that to happen. So this one is almost the opposite end of the spectrum of the Dell EMC deal that I talked about. This was the vast majority of the deals we did while I was at Dell, and this probably resonates more because I think most of the deal volume looks like this. That a lot of us are engaged in, but it's where the acquirer is just significantly bigger in terms of size, degree of staffing, and how specialized we are. Kind of back to some of the points Avneet had made about COEs. The action-oriented functional groups on the acquirer, and I can tell you, I had, like I said, I felt like I had these, aggressive animals in cages ready to be let out and let loose, but they were ready to go integrate everything in a week. It's like, hey man, I can get this thing done by Friday. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, hold up, let's back off a little bit. And the target's easily overwhelmed, especially forget the fact that they have an enormous amount of work that they're on point for, but they're going through their own personal change journey that said, I signed up to work for this little company, and, we have bean bags in our offices and, a keg in the corner. And now I just got bought by some behemoth, that rattles you, so, just asking somebody to brush that off and turn into HR professional superstar, it's not realistic. Again, and I think addressing that head on is absolutely critical. So again, the key question here is how do we realize these desired deal benefits, but without just squashing and overwhelming what we just acquired? Because again, even with the best of intentions and a high degree of sensitivity, it still happens. So what can we do and again, I start with our own function, but this can easily apply to the other functions as well. But again, we're going through it first, and I think have an opportunity to model. So I'll kind of talk about the HR as facilitator. The thing I say is beware of the one-to-many relationships. And I remember a deal that we had done. It was a pretty small company, and just maybe 100 to 200 people. And somebody showed me a chart. And this was when I owned the HR M&A in addition to my comp and bens and all that. So I saw a project plan that said, here's all the stream leaders from the Dell side, and then here's the stream leaders from the acquirer. It was the same person in every box on the acquirer. And I said, guys, if I saw my name on a chart like this, I would fake my own death. Like, there is no way I would, that is absolutely frightening, terrifying that, again, you take a benefits leader that has a team of 40 people who's dealing with somebody who deals with benefits 10% of their time. And again, it's overwhelming. So again, one of the things we say is having someone on the acquirer side who's the HR point person, and the integration planning is really more between those two. And then the acquirer HR lead is the one who facilitates and kind of works individually with each of the functional owners, at Dell, which is what we did. Because again, if you don't govern that interaction, you need someone who's going to gatekeep, manage the integration plan, and then force the trade-offs to say, hey, it's great that you think you can integrate the benefits in a week, but that's not going to happen. Like, we need to kind of, sensitize this to their ability to absorb. That HR liaison role on the acquirer side is absolutely critical. And then you'll see, we'll talk about behaviorally what that needs to look like as well. So again, it's that person can also make sure all of the appropriate contacts are made. So they're making sure the connection points are there, and they can manage that overwhelming factor really well. So the first piece, and again, I mentioned this before, but as ambassador, the empathy piece is critical, and really for both sides. And this is one that you always hear horror stories about, the acquirer coming in and running over, all these poor little companies and all that, and a lot of it is true. But you also have the opposite, where you have the acquired company that, not realizing that they just got that big foam check, they got cashed out. Well, in exchange for that, you are now part of a larger company, and your decision process looks different than it did the day before. So kind of understanding and saying, okay, I get that, but I'm going to try to influence to say, let's focus on what is necessary for integration and what's not. A lot of times what you'll see is, the acquirer is insisting that everything change regardless of whether it really needs to. And you've got the acquiree basically digging their heels in and saying, no, that's not what I signed up for. We don't need to change anything. So again, it's like having the degree of empathy as those key roles are working together is key. The other piece is, I think we're really good at jumping into the mechanical integration. But again, just that point to say, let's be real over-communicative. And by over-communicative, I don't mean let's send them a bunch of emails, but let's have one-on-ones once a week, with critical people, and just say, hey, how you doing? How are you feeling right now? What's keeping you up? So, less tactical and more just checking in. Because what you'll find there is you learn lots of things. And some of them, again, you'll find those are things, some of it is, oh, I need to do a better job of setting expectations with them because this is not going to change and it shouldn't. And then there are other things you'll find, wow, this is a key point. I don't think anyone ever intended for it to feel like that to these folks. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to leverage my influence on my own side to try to course correct that. And again, I think if you just look too mechanically at a checklist of what I have to do and forget that piece, I think it's a huge miss, because again, that's where a lot of value comes in. And the other thing is even having those discussions within HR, starting about individual aspirations, because again, it's, a lot of times that gets overlooked. But, I could sit down with the HR leader on the other side and try to understand, hey, is there interest in, working in this large company on the other end? Or if you have no interest, well, let's talk about what that looks like. But either way, let's just kind of get that on the table, and we'll address that as we're working through this integration ourselves. And again, it's realizing you're dealing with a human being that has feelings, aspirations, concerns. So, again, I think that's absolutely critical. So, some of the other things too, listening is not hearing something, it's letting them know they've been heard. I can't tell you how many times where, I've had, folks say, well, I told them, I don't know what the deal is. And, they told me, and, oh yeah, I heard that. I heard what they said. And it's like, yeah, but they don't think you heard what they said. And it's acknowledging some of those concerns. And, and again, just, that letting them know they've been heard is really key. The other thing on the acquiree HR, this is where a lot of times the acquiree HR person really has to play a lead role within their own organization. It's real easy to kind of become the victim and say, oh, look at all the bad things this big, terrible company is doing to me, versus coming into those conversations and saying, hey, here's a few things that don't feel right. Can we change this, 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 and this? And being very proactive and about asking, because I think when I've seen some of the really good HR leaders and some of these deals we've done, they've done exactly that. They sit down with me and they have a list of things they want. I'm like, that's perfect. They're not sitting back there commiserating at the water cooler about, how bad and nasty we are. They're being very proactive and very deliberate. And again, those are the people that, and, a lot of them moved on because they prefer to work in smaller environments. But those are the ones I'm like, I'm going to keep them if I absolutely have any chance of keeping this person. This is somebody I want in our organization. So again, and I'll just do a real quick, a point on this that's kind of a little bit more on the personal, gets back to the career piece. The person I had who was running this group, like before I took over this group, the leader of the HR technology group had left. So we were in the process of looking for a new one. And we had a very talented woman on the team who didn't really have tons of M&A experience, but was super sharp. So I said, all right, I'm going to elevate you into this role. I've had conversations with, my boss, the HR leader, and even Michael Dell saying, we're about to do a ton of acquisitions. So we need to go get the best in class HR tech, HR integration leader, and all that. So we said, okay, that's great. That's what we're going to get. And I had the conversation with her and said, you are wonderful as a program manager and managing kind of the tactical integration. But what we're really looking for is someone that can be that influencer, that point that can play this ambassador role with the CEO of the acquired companies, with the HR leader of the acquired companies. And, I said, here's a deal. It's going to take us a while to find somebody, but if you can really show your chops before we get there, why don't you make it to where we just stop the search because you've proven beyond shadow of doubt that you can do the role. That's exactly what she did, because on paper, her experiences, you would have said too light for someone to be running this team, but she played this role so well. And the feedback that we would get from CEOs of these acquired companies was just phenomenal. And it was funny because before I even had a chance to go back and make my case to Michael and and my boss, the HR lead, they said, she seems to really be knocking it out of the park. I think we kind of got our leader. And I said, all right, she won the race, and again, I think it just shows how critical and the difference between someone tactically managing an integration and someone who's playing that leadership role that is absolutely critical for these deals. So if we can go to the next slide. This one ought to resonate a little bit, and it's funny because you'll see the impact of morale, and this just kind of shows how people's mindset changes throughout a deal. And I remember when I first saw this and my team, we'd look at this and kind of roll our eyes and go, we're pros, this doesn't really apply to us. And then when we were at the trough, right where you get here, it's like, oh, geez, I need to get out of here. I can't take this anymore. I pulled it back out. Because we were all there, even including myself. And I said, all right, guys, does this start to resonate now? I mean, we kind of laughed at it and thought it was funny and theoretical, but it actually does resonate. And again, I think understanding this and kind of checking in along this process is another, critical piece. So I know we have a couple of minutes left. So I, want to kind of look and see if there's any questions we have not addressed yet. So anybody that's got any additional questions, please submit them through the chat.
Hi, Craig. I've had a couple that came directly to me. One of them is that CHRO and HRBPs are often really critical to the integration. What are some of the steps that you've seen taken to retain those folks, especially if people are going to be laid off as part of a redundancy or some sort of synergy realization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of it is, realistically, we generally have seen less synergy actions in the business partner space than you would typically see in COEs that are more redundant. But that said, you still have a high degree of anxiety. Honestly, beyond just the things like everybody, does the, retention and identify the critical folks and all that. But one of the things that has, I think, worked really well too, that gets them really vested in what that new world looks like, is engaging them in the building of that new world. So it's, again, even if I haven't named you as the business partner for that space, you cover that group on the target company, and we have someone who covers that group. We'll have you work together and help come together with the proposals for what that org should look like in the future. So really deeply engaging them versus I'll call you when I'm done designing it and tell you who I've selected. We've actually really engaged them even before they have actually been named. Again, it's that 2 in a box where we say, we want you to basically be on point. You each know your own legacy organizations. And some of them that we just had to say, hey, listen, I don't know that you're going to be the HR leader for the product group, but I can tell you there's a role for you here. We love you. We think you're going to be great. And a lot of it was, again, the retention is to me table stakes, but those conversations to say, hey, listen, work with us here. There's some ambiguity, but let's kind of, let's just remain calm. We will have a great role for you. It may be here, it may be somewhere else, but you're someone we want to keep in the future. And, of course, you don't want to have that conversation with someone that you ultimately think you might have to let go. But, in reality, the perceptions of those people is so much worse than the reality. You're looking at it saying, okay, I'm probably only taking out 2 people, but in their mind, you're taking out half. So again, I think just that visible, engaging them, but also having direct conversations with them, I think is absolutely critical.
Great. And we've had a couple more pop up in the chat. One about working with PEOs or other outsourced HR functions, and how do you use that to relieve the tactical duties during the transition process?
So Avneet, I think you probably have some things to share, but again, one point to me on the PEO, and again, I'd probably get a lot of arguments, especially from people who are in PEOs who are probably on this call. I think it's hard to engage them freshly as a deal pops up. I think if you have an existing one on either side, you should absolutely leverage. It's because, again, there's so many changes you're already navigating. Trying to introduce another one, new one to kind of outsource that piece can be very difficult. But to the extent you have them, any providers, whether it's outsourced benefits or anything, very heavily lean on them. Again, that's one of those, like, you'd be crazy not to, because there's so much work to be done. If you're not leveraging those folks, it's like, that's when you're really glad they're around. Avneet, anything to add on that one?
No, the long tail of integration, the tail of integration is longer than anyone ever imagines, including those of us that have seen dozens of deals. So, in that long tail lives a lot of the tactical work. So absolutely leverage. It's very difficult to introduce new partners. So especially companies that kind of sense acquisitions are coming up, creating that engagement earlier. As Greg said, it's really difficult on top of everything that's going on in the first 20 days before or 30 days after close of deal. You don't have time to onboard a new partner. So you do it before or you do it after.
So I know we're at the top of the hour, and folks are many of them are needing to leave for their next meeting, but why don't we give it one more question before we wrap up? And I like the last one that showed up here in the chat because it's a great question. Any time-tested tips or tools on building one culture, one voice, one team through the post-acquisition stages?
Geez, this one is tough because honestly, I could do an hour on this one alone. Because one of the things that I would say, though, that we did, that again, if just to kind of sum it up, we did a very bottoms up, engaging the organization in all of these surveys that went, and we had probably over 100,000 participants in these surveys from all over the world, every function from both legacy companies. But what we did is we started engaging them to say, what do you think are the 5 most critical aspects of this new company that we've created? And we kind of did this bottoms up survey. So we basically engaged the entire organization in that process rather than 6 of us in HR kind of rolled it out and emailed it out to everybody. It was a very bottoms up participative. We kind of led them all along the way to say, hey, here's what we found. Here's kind of a draft and all that. So we basically took the entire 170,000 people through that process. And then on the other end of it, it was like everyone felt like they kind of had a hand in building it. So lots of tools and tricks to get there, but that bottoms up engagement, I thought, I think was probably one of the things I'm most excited about that I've been involved in my career.
Let me just add, and that does not need to only be the domain of larger companies. We've done that for some of the smaller deals, and $1,500 on SurveyMonkey goes a long way. So it really does in building inclusivity and so on. One thing, again, merits an entire separate conversation. You don't always want one culture, one voice. You actually want multiplicity, recognizing different geographies, because any company of any size you're acquiring has these multiple cultures. So
yeah, I think that's a great call out.
Right? Yeah, but you do want to retain the special sauce, especially talent and IP driven companies. Don't force them in. Probably the biggest mistake you will make.
Yeah, I think it's more important, even in the smaller ones, again, to say there are pieces of this I am going to absolutely deliberately preserve because it's why we bought them. You know, and I would say, you know, we're not taking your grill, we're not taking your bean bag, we're not taking your keg. Relax, it's all good. We want you to be you. That's why we bought you. You know, and I think that's a big piece as well.
Well, that sounds like a great future conversation for follow-up. So thank you again, Avneet and Craig, for sharing this with us. There's been some great feedback in the chat. Really appreciate you taking the time to share this information. If folks want to get a hold of you, they can find you at Insightory, and we'll be sending out copies of the slides as well as a link to the survey I talked about at the beginning and a SHRM PDC certificate for those of you that are maintaining your SHRM credentials. Again, thank you both so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to share this information with us.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.